to be a small difference in the agenda today. What we're going to do is, because we are not talking about finances directly, I thought we'd take just a few minutes, less than 5 minutes, Pinchas, for me just to give an update about what's been happening in the financial world over the last half a year, and in particular last quarter and the last couple of weeks. And then we're going to be introducing Pinchas. So thank you very much. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. So just a quick history, and I think everybody should know this history pretty well, but it's quite difficult to actually hear it, and it's quite sobering to hear it, I think. So we started this year, and I came back from holiday very enthused about what I thought was going to be a really, really good year. I thought it was just going to be one of those years where we came off 2019, which landed up being actually quite a decent year. And I thought this was going to be another one of those decent years. Well, as we say in Yiddish, a man stracht and Gott lacht. What's it? Man supposes and God disposes, whatever the translation is. And, it certainly didn't appear that way. And I was in England in early February, and the fears of COVID were rising. The markets were already very, very nervous and were already falling quite badly, but nothing like what actually happened. By the time I got back from England, middle of February, things were getting tough, and we were very, very nervous. But in South Africa, we'd only had our first case, if you guys remember, on the 9th of February. And so we actually weren't really worried about it yet. Well, by the 19th of March, the stock markets of the world, South Africa inclusive, had dropped some 36%. And that is that's carnage. That is about as bad as you're going to get. And it was across the board. There wasn't much other than gold that was holding up. In fact, even Naspers took a bit of a knock at that time. Poor old 91 Asset Management, the ex-investor Asset Management, they chose to list around that same time. And they're one of our favorite asset managers. And that was a pretty tough time for them. But since then, markets have recovered substantially. And if one were to take a look at the JSE All Share Index, that is just a snapshot of all the shares that are on the Johannesburg Index, we're about 2% down for the year, which, considering the fact that we were down 36% only 3 months ago, I think many of us would live with. But where we still have substantial concerns is that this recovery in the markets is quite narrow. And so if you take a look at the property sector, the general retailers, that your Pick and Pay, your Checkers, your Mr. Price, Truworths, and so forth, and obviously Edgar's, you guys all know the story, how bad they are. The banking sector, the financial sector, so the banking sectors are the banks, and the financial sectors are the Old Mutuals and the Sanlams of this world, are all well in excess of 37% down for the year. So we are really still in some very difficult trading waters. And what is making money is gold. A number of mining stocks are doing well. And of course, what appears to be, we were discussing before how well Zoom has done. And of course, the likes of Naspers, which owns MultiChoice, our DSTV, and the likes of Prosus owns that today, and Naspers, which owns Tencent, which is the Chinese like Facebook type of thing, and gambling and all that. They've done incredibly well over this period, and so there's some very limited number of stocks that are doing well, whilst a number of stocks are under pressure. To put things into perspective around the world, the British index, known as the FTSE, is down over 16.5%. The French and the German indexes, those are the biggest economies in the US, are down some 14% and 2% respectively. And the Dow Jones, that's the US index, is down nearly 6%. But what's most important, most interesting, is the NASDAQ, which is the tech-heavy index, is up some 16%. 17%, my apologies. And as Neil was saying before, the company that we're operating on now, Zoom, was worth $16 billion at the beginning of the year, I think Neil said. And if I remember correctly, you said over $70 billion in value today. And that's an increased value. And we, of course, are proudly contributing to this. So of course, the prescribed asset issue, which looks to be next year's crisis that we will no doubt be facing. But I'm happy to tell you that the Octagon funds, and I'm extraordinarily proud to tell you that the Octagon funds, and I saw before that we have Robin Edwards online with us, and she's part of the team that help us construct those funds. They've done incredibly well. And so we're very, very thankful to our corporate partners, Sanlam and Graviton in particular, for helping funds, both the local funds and the offshore funds have actually really, really held up well in a very tough market, where some balanced funds are still trading below 20% negative. So it's incredibly tough, and thankfully we're nowhere near those levels. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is our very quick, it took me exactly 5 minutes, Neil, please take note, our quick introduction. And without any further ado, I want to introduce Pinchas. Pinchas is a psychologist in practice. And as we mentioned before, in jest, but obviously very seriously as well, Pinchas, you know, this is a very, very tough time. And I phoned some colleagues of mine who work for 91 Asset Management, and they said to me, "Oh, what a wonderful thing to receive a phone call from you." And I go, "Why?" They say, "You're the effervescent bloke. You're always happy. We're so sad. We need someone to give us some happiness." And their share price is doing very well. Their funds are doing incredibly well. What would they be so unhappy about? And then you forget about the human element. This isn't all about money. This is about people being pent up in their homes. And of course, we take cognizance of the fact that we're lucky enough to live in homes. Many people live in the streets or in shacks. But just taking cognizance of the broader world around us, Pinchas, it's not easy times, is it?
No. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me, Nachin, and inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit this morning, a very general talk about the psychological understanding of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to begin by referring to a number of different stats that have been generated around the world. An April 2020 poll in America reported that 45% of adults polled had reported that their mental health had been negatively impacted due to stress over the virus. And broad research is linking social isolation and loneliness to poor mental health. In actual fact, 47%, this is again American statistics, of people in lockdown reported negative mental health effects due to worry and stress related to COVID, as opposed to populations not in lockdown. So we can see already just the remedy for dealing with this lockdown in itself is causing, as having negative effects on people. High-risk groups have been identified in terms of psychological risk. Generally, older adults and, interestingly enough, adolescents in households are seen to be more high-risk people. Reports suggest that job loss is highly associated with increased rates of depression, anxiety, irritability, low self-esteem, which often leads to substance abuse and sometimes suicide. And again, that's not a shocking finding. You know, we all see that, but what's interesting enough is they're starting to show it in research that this is now a fact. It's not just a theory. And burnout, definitely amongst frontline workers, specifically in the health field, is a very big concern at the moment. They show that in terms of adults in lockdown, 21% had reported major negative impacts of the lockdown to them in terms of psychological health, and 27% had reported minor mental health effects. Adults not in lockdown, only 13% as opposed to 21% reported major negative impact, and 24% as opposed to 27% reported a minor impact. In terms of losing their jobs, 26% people reported negative impact and 26% reported minor impact. Where people hadn't lost their jobs, only 15% had been affected and 25% to a lesser degree. So again, none of that is rocket science, and probably we could all have predicted something along that pattern. A lot of studies have come out of China and Asia, obviously because that's where it started first. So a lot of the research there started first on human populations. And pretty much all the studies, there are a lot, I'm condensing them all into one quick paragraph, have shown that the COVID-19 infection can be implicated in the development of anxiety, depression, alcohol abuse, and these are fueled often by the experience of quarantine in one's home, infection of a family member or a friend, and definitely death of somebody who's close to you can fuel those and make them worse. And what mental health workers are worried about is that ongoing stress could lead to deeper permanent psychological damage. That's what we're worried about going forward. There was an article, it was written by a Belgian professor of health psychology, and the article was entitled, "Lockdown is the world's biggest psychological experiment, and we will pay the price." And if you think about it, the conservative estimate is 2.6 billion people, about a third of the world's population, are living under some level of quarantine. It is the largest psychology research thing ever in our history in modern psychology. And the hypothesis is that people who are quarantined are likely to develop a range of symptoms of psychological stress, possibly a disorder. It would include low mood. So maybe for yourself, when I list these symptoms, just tick for yourself and see if any of these resonate with you. Low mood, insomnia, stress, anxiety, anger, irritability, emotional exhaustion, depression, some post-traumatic symptoms. The most common ones that stand out the most are low mood and irritability. And then when you include children into the quarantine, things just seem to get worse. One is, I can tell you now, there's going to be rich research being done over the next 20 years of what this period of quarantine has done to this generation of younger kids. That's all going to start coming out at some point. But also for the parents, I'm not sure in the audience who are parents who've got kids at home, but now you have to be a parent, you have to be a worker, and you have to be a homeschool facilitator along with your teachers. And everyone's locked in the house together. Some families can manage that pretty well. For some families, that's pretty hard. So the minute we talk about kids in a household, there's a whole new game. It's a whole new ball game. So they looked at the previous outbreak of SARS, SARS-1 virus, and they looked at healthcare workers and found that a lot of them had to be quarantined as part of their work. And they found the quarantined staff were at longer term risk for alcohol abuse, self-medication, definitely long-lasting avoidant behavior. So that was what came out of there. So in France, there's been a lot of work on trauma. And Israel's using a similar model, and we at Hatzalah also have introduced this model here to South Africa. What they found in France was when emergency workers, specifically ambulance guys, came onto a scene where there was carnage, they would set up a tent and do triage to get all the guys to help all the medical guys. But what they started doing was they set up a second tent to do a psychological triage. They found that bystanders, people watching, other participants in an accident or in something, that trauma that had happened, were also damaged. And they found that by intervening right at the start, using what we now call psychological first aid, which is not therapy, it's a very different model, they were able to actually reduce the incidence of post-traumatic stress symptoms afterwards. So I'm putting that point in now. I will connect it later on to what I'm trying to say. So the Belgian professor who I gave that title of the world's biggest psychological experiment pointed out that she predicts that there will be a huge amount of absenteeism in the workforce going forward. She sees in the next 3 to 6 months that there will be a massive rate of absenteeism because people, one, are afraid to catch COVID at work, and they're going to try and avoid work. And the World Health Organization did a benchmark study in Belgium before the lockdown, started there 2 weeks before lockdown. They found that 32% of the population would be classified as resilient and 15% showed toxic levels of stress. 2 weeks after lockdown, they found that 32% as resilient had now gone down to 25%, and the 15% was up to 25% of the people with toxic stress. And again, people who work in mental health know prolonged stress leads to further decompensation. So the hypothesis is that number will increase. So that's where she's saying that the population is at high risk for long-term absenteeism, and that even those who stay at work, there's probably going to be a loss of productivity that was estimated at 32%. So there's going to be a huge knock-on effect. So that was the international stats. So let me give you a demographic study that was done in South Africa by the University of Johannesburg. And they found out, they did a study in March going to April over 3 weeks. And they polled their samples once a week over 3 weeks. Everybody got questioned 3 times to take measurements of where they were. And what they found was that 32% of adults were depressed, 45% were fearful, and 25% had extreme loneliness in lockdown. What they found a chief driver in this was hunger, which makes sense in our South African situation. They divided the study into well-off and not well-off people. And not well-off people were generally people living on subsidies, members of families living off a grandparents' pension, people that there's no savings, they generally did casual informal labor and were relying on food parcels. And the results there that 60% of South Africans under COVID-19 are stressed, 46% are scared, 33% are depressed, 35% are irritable, 7% are bored, and 29% are lonely. And what they did find was that women seemed to have a higher rate of depression than men. What was interesting was younger South Africans are more prone to boredom. 59% of adolescents reported being bored, but only 29% of 65 years and up reported being bored. All race groups report pretty much at the beginning of lockdown, reported that lockdown measures were not harsh. This was when we started what later on was called level 5. At the time, I don't know if it was level 5 at the beginning, but it became level 5. That these were pretty much in the mid-80s, 85, 86%. There was agreement amongst all race groups. Lockdown measures were not too harsh, that they had great trust in the president, and that COVID were and would make my financial position worse. This was an awareness going in. What was interesting, South Africa also picked up denialists of COVID showed much less stress than those who accepted that COVID was real. And we've seen that in health research. Cancer patients who live in denial, who are in denial, tend to live longer than terminal patients who are not in denial. A doctor in a coastal town reported that his consults were taking longer with patients because they wanted to have a talk, because they were lonely and bored. Okay, so thus far I've bombarded you with a lot of stats and very grim forecasts of a bleak mental health outlook in the coming months and possibly years. And as I was joking with Nachi earlier on, I was saying all the mental health people are going cha-ching, but I don't think that is the case. We were joking at work that at the start of lockdown that all the divorce lawyers were going cha-ching and all the obstetricians were going cha-ching because it's going to go one or the other way. The marriages will break up or there's going to be lots of children. That's kind of the outlook. But I'd like to make a shift to maybe a more psychological understanding of what's happening to us. I'd like to begin by presenting a view that appeared in the Psychology Today magazine that I thought put an interesting spin on things. The writer starts by asserting that COVID-19 has unleashed an epidemic of anxiety in society. And then everybody's come up with suggestions, all sorts of good quick fixes, how to do this, how to do that, take this vitamin, take that vitamin, these kind of things, do this exercise, do this yoga. And all of it sounds very good, but she says we need to look at the big picture. She says, what's happening? And I'd be curious to know how many people have experienced this themselves. Our future horizons feel changed. We've been taken down to a survival level on Maslow's hierarchy. We've got job loss, we've got businesses hanging on by a thread, we've got financial insecurity. So suddenly life is not so secure anymore. Our essential priorities are in flux. The unwritten rules by which we live have suddenly been changed. And her assertion is that the rules we live by, you earn your keep and you protect those you love. The one that I thought was really important was doing nothing is harder than doing something. You know, when we reach a challenge, say, I don't know, we have some fictitious nation that invades our country. We all know what we have to do. There's a sense of, we can think about it, we can see it, it's tangible. We can rise to the occasion. How do you rise to the occasion when you get told, go home and lock down? Hunker down in your house and just wait there. It doesn't feel like we're doing something. And it causes for most people a loss of identity. Our identities are often tied up in the work we do. I'm a doctor, I'm a financial planner, I'm a bus driver, I'm a cashier, I'm a whatever. It's part of our identity. And suddenly our work has been disturbed. We can't go to our offices. And the interdependent relationships that help us to fulfill who we are now being disturbed. And we've seen in emotions, this leads to a lot of helpless rage. And as the period of lockdown leads to a loss of productive role in society, we also start to feel like it's burdensome. We don't know what to do with this. So I'd be curious to see if they did another poll in the South African thing to see how people are feeling about, is the lockdown burdensome? Are they still liking what the president is saying? That kind of thing. I'd be curious to see what comes out of it. The other aspect is operating in defense leads to secondary effects that we need to anticipate. For instance, hoarding is not an economically sustainable thing to do. And that when pressure on income leads to pulling out of investing, these are things we need to stimulate the economy. So we have to make very hard decisions about how to handle those things. So I'm going to go into a little bit about, I'm going to just draw everything down to stress and trauma right now, because that seems to be the common psychological symptom that underlies a lot of what is coming out of the research. And we know that disastrous events can cause people to become traumatized and stressed. And we know that many events in our daily life also stress our physical and psychological resources and can have negative effects on our physical and psychological health. We've seen in research that periods of stress and anxiety, people are less less likely to engage in preventative health measures such as eating well, exercising, or doing what they need to do. And also high stress, we know medically reduces an ability to fight off infections in the body's immune system because it becomes impaired, which is a bit of a scary idea. And we've seen this a lot in the area of psychoneuroimmunology that started in the 90s and coming out of HIV research. So we gauge the severity of stress by the degree of disruption to individuals' functioning. And these are in turn affected by the stresses, characteristics, and individual resources. So, and I'm stressing stress characteristics and individual resources because those are going to be things that can turn this thing into an absolute disaster or into something where we can actually come out whole and better. The longer a stressor operates, the more severe its effects on us. And that the more closely we're involved with them, the symptoms intensify. So research, a guy by a group called Pinchas and F, researched a shooting in an American school. And they found that the kids who were closest to where the shooting took place were more traumatized than those who were in classrooms, and those who didn't come to school that day because they were ill or away, they were less stressed. The only thing about COVID is we're all involved in it. There aren't degrees other than infection. We all pretty much pulled into it. So the question is, how long and what is the effect of this on us? There is a saying, one person's stress is another person's piece of cake. So we have to look at what are perceptions of stress. That if a stressor is seen as highly threatening, and especially if you see your coping resources are not as strong, you're going to react very badly to it. It's going to affect you. What we found that helps is information, facts, helps because anxiety is often about fearing something that will happen that may not happen. Whereas if you get facts, you can then knock out a lot of the kind of irrational fears. That's what emergency services use when they train people. They do repeated exposure to intense situations and scenes, be they ambulance training, cops, whatever, because it helps them to develop an immunity, as it were, almost to what they're facing. Also, knowing how long the stress is going to last alters the severity when it actually happens. And at the moment, we're sitting with COVID, where we just don't know how long is a piece of string. We don't know where this is going to end. Stress tolerance, the other concept, refers to a person's ability to withstand stress without becoming severely impaired. And positive family and social relationships, we know, can moderate the effects of stress on an individual and reduce illness. And lack of them can increase the potency of the stress. So another factor that has come in research since the 1980s is the concept of hardiness. So I want to balance out the gloom and doom view with also saying that we as people also have an ability to withstand and thrive in these times of stress and hardship. And the word hardiness, I think, has become the more common word we use now is resilience. And it was found that individuals who exhibited higher resilience, hardiness, tended to perceive fewer events as stressful. So when they saw events, they didn't see them as stressful. So their response to them was very, very different. And they tended to remain healthy. Whereas the opposite happened when people were identified as having lower hardiness. They tended to see events, they tended to perceive things as more stressful and more disastrous and more prone to illness. And if we look at COVID, it's almost like started as an acute stressor that's become quite chronic. So we have to then look at coping strategies. That stress forces a person to do something. We respond to it in some way. And what is done depends on the influence of the stress. So you're confronted with two challenges when you're faced with stress. One is to meet the requirements of the stressor, and the other is to protect yourself from psychological damage and disorganization. So when you feel up to handling the stressor, we call this a task-oriented response. So this is a person who will appraise a situation, they'll decide on a strategy, they'll take action, and then evaluate the feedback, and then depending on the feedback, they'll come up with a new plan. Okay. When you don't feel up to that, when you're not feeling you can handle the stress, so we talk about a defense-oriented response. So your behavior becomes aimed at preventing hurt and disorganization rather than resolving the situation. So we tend to then forsake productive task-oriented response. We don't do it. We try to protect the integrity itself. Even if the behavior is self-defeating and advanced, it becomes a very emotional response. And we talk about ego defense mechanisms, repression and denial, which I'll talk a little bit more further on. And if it goes on too long, it creates deeper psychological problems. A different way of looking at it suggests we have a need to feel control in our lives, and that when this is threatened, it becomes a problem for an individual. In reality, it's very much an issue of perceived control, because I don't think we can control everything in our lives. So we will surrender behavioral control to maintain perceived control over our well-being. So we have to feel that we are in control. It might not be a fact, and we might not actually really be in control, but we have to feel it. And if we assume events are beyond our control and nothing can be done to improve the future, it creates a problem, because that will lead to illness of some kind. It was interesting, there was a model that came out in the 1980s, I think it was a guy called Rogers, and he looked at it, and he said there were 4 factors, but the three of the factors were important. He said, in encouraging preventative behaviors, you have to have a sense of there's the communication that there's a high level of threat. You are in danger, that there's vulnerability, you can get sick and you can die, and that there's behaviors you can do, what they call high response efficacy, that you can do that will keep you safe. And this will lead to you engaging in preventative behaviors, which is pretty much what I think the government's original message was, which was, there is a disease that's out there, it's become a pandemic, it's dangerous, you could die, you could get very sick and die and do the whole ventilator trip in ICU. And if you wash your hands and you stay at home and you socially distance, you will be safe. And for a lot of people, that's what they did. They did exactly that, and then we added the masks on later on. And that has given people a perceived sense of control and a sense of that they can do something to keep themselves safe. But we have a deeper part of our psyche. So while most of us live kind of very comfortably in our normal lives with very little disruption to our lives, we have a regular salary, we have our homes, we have our families, our kids go to school. We don't live on the street. We're not the guy standing at the intersection with the please God help me sign, seeing what we could get, or the unemployed guy sitting waiting to get picked up in a bucket for someone who needs some construction work done. And we're not unemployed or desperate. So we look and we see the problem as being over there. It's them. It's over there. And what we do in psychologically in our brain is we split up thinking into us and them. Okay, because people will disagree. People might argue with me. It's fine. But in psychoanalytic thinking, we think that people see this kind of living. This creates guilt, and we have to protect ourselves. We can't be driving around every day to work, past every beggar on the street, and feeling guilty. And we have unconsciously, it's a defensive mechanism that prevents the outside from getting into us. But with COVID, we're all in the same boat. The world seems to be falling apart. The playing field has been leveled, and we're all equally vulnerable to infection. So we retreat into lockdown, but we have no way of getting revenge on the virus, because the normal instinct is to fight back. We have to fight back. What's interesting is what has happened out of this is this not being able to retaliate and get revenge. I think it's been, we see it on TV, we're seeing a lot of xenophobia. There was a lot of very anti-Chinese rhetoric at the beginning of this whole thing. Certainly Trump called it the Chinese infection. We've seen a lot of racism coming out. I'm not even talking about George Floyd, just there's been a lot of racism you see in the press. And definitely spousal abuse. Those numbers, family abuse, physical abuse within families are shot up. We saw in South Africa when the sale of alcohol was allowed. A friend of mine is a trauma doctor at Milpark was saying that the first weekend had a 60% increase in trauma events brought on by alcohol. So a normal retaliation would be a normal response. So we now become into a place where we feel psychologically vulnerable, and we have to retreat into homes and lock our gates. That's the response. So we have to use defenses, and from a psychoanalytic point of view, the explanation goes, we begin to use aggression as a defense in our thinking. So we go back to a better time. So like when mom held us or fed us, and the world feels restored and feels like a safe place again. But babies experience fragmentation when they're thwarted, when they don't get what they want. And that's what we as adults feel as well. We have to realize we have to manage this alone. And the less resilient will return to the world, seeing it as a very dangerous place. For many, this period of lockdown will activate new hurt. I've got a lot of patients who I feel like I've almost gone back to the beginning of therapy. It's almost like we've gone right back to the beginning. Symptoms have just shot up. Old issues have come back into their heads. This whole experience of lockdown has shaken a lot of people to the core, and it results in psychic pain. And that needs to be understood and held. And that's what we as mental health practitioners are seeing, we're projecting going forward, is that people are going to need help. A lot of people said to me, wow, you guys are going to be so needed now and in the coming. Up to now, I think a lot of people have managed quite well. I think we're starting to see people having difficulties, and we're projecting that there are going to be more difficulties going forward. But the interesting thing is, for some, lockdown will produce a wave of creativity and adaptation that will help them to manage this experience and actually come up more enriched. For myself, the one thing I've loved from lockdown is that I can have supper with my family every night. Because I normally work until 7 and my kids are young, so they can't wait for me to come home for supper. And one of the things we've really had is supper. It's been absolutely wonderful. And we've had more time to talk, we've had more family time, and that definitely made a difference in our lives. So I think if people can look and see what actually works for them out of this lockdown. Yes, there are problems, work, salaries, all sorts of other things. All of us have to face the profound feeling that loss will engender. The one thing that this COVID thing has done to us on an emotional level is we've lost a perceived sense of security in the world. What seemed like, as Nachi said, it was going to come and be this great year. Suddenly, the carpet's been whipped out from underneath us. All predictability, all the things we took for granted are now in flux, they're up for grabs. We've lost contact with the people we care about. I know as a psychologist, having to work on Zoom has been incredibly difficult. I very much rely on being present with my patients and the full body experience. And the loss of that has been very hard for me and for my patients. And working on Zoom is hard for both of us because it emphasizes that loss. And I think not being able to go to your friends, have people come for supper, go for supper, meet for coffee, having that normal sense of engagement with people around you has been a great emotional loss for people. A lot of people have lost a sense of self and purpose in their daily life. We have to deal with the potential loss of family and friends. I mean, now the deaths are jumping. We've had a death of a very close family friend of ours, and I think that's where a lot of people are worried. There's a lot of anticipatory anxiety now around the fact that I've got older parents, and I worry about them. A lot of young people have said to their parents, come and live with us, or we're doing your shopping. People are worried because we're worried about losing people who are vulnerable, members of our family who might be immunocompromised. Everybody knows this word now, immunocompromised, and we've identified who's immunocompromised, and we're doing whatever we can to keep them safe. So there is that, and there's definitely mourning that will have to take place in the future, and many people will be able to mourn effectively and get past this and come out okay, and many people won't. That's what we're hypothesizing will happen. There is a kind of irony of this, irony about all of this from a psychiatric perspective. As I previously mentioned, aggression seems to be the most common defense that people use in this epidemic. So we move from very mature kind of behaviors to less mature behaviors. Because we're defending against persecutory anxiety. People are anxious, people are stressed. So people develop what we call a somatic preoccupation. Am I going to get COVID? They're worried about the health, this cough, this sniffle, my temperature's rising. People are suspicious, where have you been? Can you come into my house? Can you not? Irritability goes up. The irony is that OCD patients are seeing everybody having to compulsively wash their hands now. They're no longer just the only people washing hands. And people with anxiety disorders are seeing we're all in the same boat as everybody with anxiety disorders, we're all anxious. And when we see people regress, we see high levels of paranoia. And some people are paranoid, over-paranoid, and some people are under-paranoid. They have this macho style that I'm maintaining my independence. And it's very much a defense against feeling overwhelmed by your powerlessness in the situation. I'm going to throw a bit of Freud in just because I'm a psychologist. I hope it doesn't bore you, but I find it kind of interesting. Freud often talks about the oral phase and the anal phase of development. And the anal phase corresponds with toilet training. It's very much about control and power. And I think this is very apropos now because this is very much about an issue of who's in control. With COVID, we're all experiencing a loss of control. And some people have engaged in obsessive cleaning as a way of control. I've got a patient whose mom drives him mad because when she comes in from shopping, there's literally a sanitation of shopping that would make any person in an operating room proud. A nurse who has to clinically sanitize surgical equipment would be very impressed by what this woman does with the shopping. The oral phase is about incorporation, eating and taking in. And this is where we see this thing all around the world. I don't think it's so much in South Africa. Maybe it is. It was in the beginning, but less now, is hoarding and stockpiling. Because in America, you can go into a supermarket and there are shortages. So people are stockpiling, they hoarding. You know, when we are caught in a pathological defense thinking, our perception of time is impaired. This is a really important thing, because time, time gives what a sense of something that's external. And when time stops, we become frozen in an external condition. We're trapped in this nightmare of COVID. In a healthy state of mind, time is more predictable. And so there's a possibility of an end. So even if we say, a healthy way of looking at it is, even if COVID comes back again, we will still go through this, but there's an end. It will end. And when we know there's an end, there's an aspect of hope, that we have hope. And that's what we need right now, is hope. Okay, so I hope I'm not talking too fast, but through the talk, what I've done is highlighted that it's possible to get through this assault on our psyche in one piece. And it's related to how our mind is processing and rising up to the challenge of the pandemic. If I feel I'm up to the task, then I will experience, if I feel I'm not up to the task, sorry, I will experience more debilitating symptoms than I feel as if I am up to the task. And I'll give an example from my practice. In preparing before the lockdown, when we knew it was coming, I did a lot of work with my patients because I knew I wouldn't see a lot of them for a while. And what we did was we discussed, I don't like the word co-creation because it's not my theoretical paradigm, but we kind of co-created. What we did is we discussed thoughts and fears about how the lockdown would affect them and how to keep going through lockdown. And the catchphrase that we worked out together with a number of our adult patients was, the situation can structure you, or you can structure the situation. And but this meant that you can allow the lockdown, you can either allow the lockdown to drive you and convince you that you have no agency whatsoever, or you can rise to the challenge and decide how you're going to manage it. There's certain realities. You're in lockdown, you're in quarantine, you're at home. It's going to affect your work, it's going to affect your finances, it's going to affect a whole lot of things. The question is, do those things drive you into a hole, or can you find a way to work with them? And for us, what we identified was the most important factor was structure. So I've got a page. So we looked at basic rules: was don't sleep late, eat well, do some exercise. I mean, these are all the things that you've heard being said before. Eating meals, trying to work on spirituality for some people, and that workouts are workouts, not slackouts. That lockdown is not a staycation. It's about you trying to be as normal you can in an abnormal situation. And I've got a patient where he and his wife, literally their business has been wiped out. They were working in conferencing and their business has been wiped out. Every conference, and there were major international conferences they were organizing, all got cancelled. Because the thought was, you cannot have people coming into these places and it goes against all the ideas of lockdown and preventing transmission of disease and then international travel. And they get up every morning at 6, and they have every single day. They get up in the morning at 6, they've got some gym equipment in their garage, they pull the cars out, they do gym. They get up, they have breakfast, they're very devout Christians, they have a prayer session, and then they sit down at their dining room table, they've got their computers and they work. They are in contact with their staff, they're checking what's going on, they're making plans for the future, they're trying to find new things. Like a lot of fashion designers became people who were manufacturing masks because they didn't have people coming buying clothes, so they switched their business over to making masks, which they knew was a time-limited thing. At some point it's going to run out, and they'll go back to making clothes. So they were looking for alternatives. They're doing a lot of reading of self-help books and development books, and one of the wife of my patients is actually writing a book, a business book, out of her work and things that she's done. And they're doing incredibly well, yet financially they're under assault. They've tried to keep their staff, keep them paying because they don't want to let the staff go. And they've really, really done well. I've got another student, a university student, who towards the end of last year, he'd been struggling at university, started this year, was really doing well, doing his work, attending lectures, getting assignments in on time, which had been a problem before. Since lockdown, most of the day is spent on PlayStation, and there's nothing I can do over Zoom. I'm struggling to get him to activate and work in it. And so you can see two very different responses to the experience of lockdown. In the one, they really rose to the challenge, and it might seem extreme, like, are they delusional? But in some sense, they really rose to it. And the other one, it's just been overwhelming. He just feels imprisoned. His parents won't let him go out, and because they're absolutely paranoid about it. And he's so frustrated, and it's a ticking time bomb. We're trying to work with ways just to cope with that and deal with that. So that would be an example. I think I've spoken for enough, and I've tried to speak very fast, just because time is running. Naki, I don't know if you want to take over and moderate.
So good morning. So thank you very much. I'm just going to put my earphones back in again. My big ears, they get quite uncomfortable. But so Pinchas, that was incredibly enlightening, and it's always good to know that. I know this sounds like a strange statement, but it's always good to know that we're not going crazy, and that whatever we're feeling, everybody else seems to be feeling the same, and it's quite well within normal parameters. And I'm a father of two teenagers who are wonderful kids, but they're teenagers nonetheless, and they've got their own challenges. And Peter, I hope that you can hang on for a few more moments. I've got quite a few questions sent through that I'd like to pose to you and just get your opinion on them. So the first one is, which I've got to tell you, this is the one that obviously means a lot to me. How can we build resilience in young children, in tweens, to help them going through this period? I mean, like, the same question is followed up by the same person who's asking. We can rationalize what's happening around us. We are very cognizant, we're able to understand the world around us a little bit better. But the younger tweens, it must be incredibly hard for them to understand what's happening, to watch their parents behave in unusual ways, to watch the environment around them change in these radical ways. How can we best, well, I think it's two ways: not put our issues on our kids on the one issue, and on the other hand, protect them and help them, get the life skills to deal with all this.
Okay, so at risk of sounding like a cliched shrink, I think the first thing is, as adults for us, is to just first of all acknowledge what's going on in ourselves. That we are scared, we are frightened, we are anxious, we are under threat, we're feeling under duress. Because the minute you label your feeling, you give it shape and form. It's not this amorphous thing that just controls you. And that once you can label it and give it shape and form, then you can see what the next step should be. And that's where the things like, when I was talking about structure become important, kids model on us. Kids learn very quickly not to trust what adults say, because we say one thing, can behave exactly the opposite, and we can rationalize it. Younger kids especially can't. They have what we call a pre-conventional level of morality. It's right or it's wrong, and that's how it works. So the first thing is, how do you model coping with the situation? So things like, if you need to, there's no question in the sports psychology literature, the sports science literature, aerobic exercise helps to enhance mood. So before you start throwing down a handful of pills down your throat, is to first of all give yourself structure to your day. Much like my first patient, they get out their exercise. If you can get out and exercise, are you watching what you're eating? People are putting on weight at the moment. Are you trying to eat healthy? For myself, I'm finding a lot of release in baking. But the key is, if say a couple can talk to themselves, not in a scary, gruesome way in front of their kids, but to show that let's talk about what's going on. Then you've got to practice a thing called listening, which is listen to your kids. Ask your kids how they're doing, what's going on. They need containment. So for me, a particular challenge has been, it's funny for a psychologist who works with children as well, is when my kids get needy, it's like, I just want to just close in, just go and hide under a duvet. And the biggest struggle for me and for my wife has been screen time. Because all the kids are on screens for school. They're doing Zoom school, they're like online school, whatever the name is. But at the same time, you're at home and they get bored of the toys they've got and the activities they've got. So now they want to get onto their tablets, get onto YouTube, get onto Roblox, get onto Minecraft. Can we get onto PlayStation? And that has been a real challenge, because my feeling on that is that is something that gets them to close out. It's a form of what we call a schizo defense. They pull away. They disappear into a fantasy world, and then they're not dealing with reality. And the electronic babysitting is useful at times, there's no question. So the question is, the stress for the parents when there's a child at home is, you need to engage your child, which means you need to play with them, you need to be with them, you need to do stuff with them. But the problem is, it's all at home. You can't take them to Gold Reef City, you can't take them to Chibby Jungles, or to jump or bounce or gravity. You've got to do it at home, which then taxes you as an adult and as a parent, because you've got things to do as well. For me, coming back to my office, I'm seeing people here in face to face, and it has been quite a relief, because I don't have to always be there for my kids, I have to say, quite selfishly. So I think part of it is that we have to model for our kids what we want them to take. And to accept that they are going to be scared, that these are scary times, these are odd times. The research into the effect on children is going to go on for the next 20 years, there's no question. All the MA and PhD students are so thrilled because they've got new topics that nobody's done. So they've got lots of work going. Yeah, I hope that kind of addresses what was asked.
It does. What a true academic response. So the next question over here is, again, it's in fact, it's allied to exactly what you were just saying. I'm going to read it verbatim. Comparing the long-term effects on people who experience war and an example still feel that they may run out of food, for example, during the Shoah, the Holocaust. All of us, but more so kids, may have long-term trauma. So, it was the same type of thing. What advice would you give us to assist kids and to avoid this later on? And would that just be honest with them, share your feelings, ask them to share their feelings, that type of thing? Is that where we are?
So definitely sharing your feelings, but again, in terms of the maturity that they can manage. I mean, you don't want to vomit all your stuff onto your kids, because that's also just going to be damaging. But the idea is to show them your vulnerability, but also how you're going to cope with it. That you're not helpless and feeling just tossed around in waves. And that's where you have to model how you're coping with it, which means the big challenge for adults is irritability. Like snapping at your kids is just sending the complete wrong message. You're not coping, which makes them immediately feel unsafe. Because children rely on us to contain them and to make them feel safe. You often see in divorces, the kids, even the parents should never be together, and everybody knows this, the kids still have reunification fantasies. They still want mom and dad together because they're egocentric. They're worried about their security needs. And mom and dad being together makes me feel secure, even though it's a fantasy, it's a fiction. But that's what they need. So the key here is they're under threat, they're feeling scared, this is all unusual. And how do you deal with it? The honesty to me is generally the best policy, obviously tactfully. But you can show them your vulnerability and that you can tolerate their box. When they're being needy, they're feeling vulnerable, they're needy. They're not just being difficult, they're like clinging onto you to mess you up. They are in emotional distress. And if you can just hold on to that and recognize that and respond to that, then you can do a lot of help for your kids, no question.
Well, let me ask you this. Funny, this is in response to a private message that was sent to me. What about interspousal relationships here? So, like in my case, my wife doesn't work. And so, like our dynamic has always been a certain way. And me working from home has been the biggest blessing ever. For us, for my children, for my marriage, it's been phenomenal. But I would imagine that we're amongst the lucky few, that some people now being forced to work from home isn't a good thing. And spending, I know this sounds very idiosyncratic, but too much time with your spouse, that probably also isn't so good. So I don't know. I mean, in my case, it's been the biggest blessing. But how do you view this? How do you see the interspousal relationships? And I don't obviously married people. I mean, people in relationships in general.
Sure. I think if you are able to, if you have ability to communicate with each other and you can talk about stuff, then you can negotiate that really effectively. And these are the kind of people who will thrive in this very difficult time. I think if you're not able to talk about it, you're not able to just honestly deal with how you are feeling, it's going to feel like you're in prison. That was the remark I made right at the beginning. Like the divorce lawyers are all going to Ching and all the obstetricians are going to Ching because either it's going to end in bed or it's going to end in court. And I think, it's a word said in jest, but I think that's how we were all feeling as psychologists before, and we were worried that this is going to place an unbearable stress on some marriages. The other aspect as well, just from a psychiatric point of view, is this lockdown can exaggerate pre-existing conditions. So people have major depressions, bipolarity, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, substance, addiction disorders. But these kind of things will also get stressed. They will be under additional stress, which is a very, very scary thing. So all psychiatrists and psychologists are trying to monitor their patients very, very carefully.
Pinchas, I need to ask you, how much more time do you have? Because the questions are coming in thick and fast. So I can keep you going for a while. Have you got a while? Sorry, because these are, I'm looking at these questions, I'm thinking these are brilliant questions, and I'm so really want to ask you them. I'll be as quick as I can. Next one. Notwithstanding the possibility of it leading to codependence and addictions, as well as the supposed impact on the hospital system, do you agree or disagree with the president's decision to suspend the sale of alcohol? The vast majority of people don't abuse alcohol, but have a casual drink to relax from time and find some joy in the stress of lockdown. I did hear you quoting I think it was an emergency room colleague of yours who was speaking about that. But from a psychological standpoint, I can tell you now, when I sit with clients and I say, right, it's time to start planning your retirement, and you've got to do a really hard budget, I often advise, have a glass of wine first. It's not an easy conversation. It's not a conversation you particularly want to get involved in. Who wants to go and discuss the minutiae of money? So what is your opinion on that? Or is it as clear as day, those who do abuse, it's those we're trying to stop, and the rest of us must just suck it up? Is that a fair way to say?
So look, I think this is my opinion. Hopefully it's academically informed, but it is also my opinion to a large degree. I actually think the suspension of sale of alcohol is a good thing. I think the suspension of sale of cigarettes is stupid. I understand the argument about lungs and people who smoke lungs, but the fact of the matter is, making people go on cold turkey or smoking is just ridiculous. And it's the one thing that helps them people who smoke are addicted to the nicotine, and it helps them. Whereas alcohol, under stress, people start to self-medicate with alcohol. And the problem with alcohol is that it becomes physically addictive as well as psychologically addictive. So at some point you cross a line where even though the stress is not there, you still need the alcohol. That's the one. The other is, if you look at it from a middle class neighborhood point of view, nice sort of, waspy neighborhoods, yes, a lot of people, they're not alcoholics and they're social drinkers and they have a glass of wine, they're able to control themselves. But there are a lot of people who don't. But if you look at a wider point, when you're looking at people living in greater poverty, alcohol is one of the antidepressants. The problem is, and you can imagine, we're living in a nice house, a suburban house in lockdown. You're living in a shack on East Bank in Alexandra or in Orange Farm. I had to drive out to Lone Hill at one point to go and get a piece of medical equipment. I remember driving along, Corporate Road, and coming up to Main Road, and there's a squatter camp just on the side of the road. And there was no social distancing, there were no masks, people were sitting next to each other. And you can imagine that alcohol in those tense situations tends to inflame, because it's a central nervous system depressant. So it inflames a whole lot of people's, let's say, more primitive emotions. So aggression comes out, the aggressive drunk, the melancholic drunk, the euphoric drunk, those things become prominent. And I think that's the problem we see. So that's what I would say. Yes. So minority, I don't know if it's a minority or majority, but the people who can control are going to have to make a sacrifice, just because I think it's in a greater societal interest. That's my view. You can argue with me.
I happen to have the same view as you, so I'm kind of cool with that. I'm going to ask you two more questions, because there are quite a few, but I'm going to just select. So the one which, I find a very courageous question, and I applaud the person for asking it. I'm going to quote literally. Things like feeling lethargic, down, no energy during lockdown period. Is this a form of depression? And when do we snap out of it? And okay. and the in brackets, it's there not asking for a friend. Okay, I think that's incredibly courageous. Things like so she duplicates. What do you think?
Okay, so I would certainly not, and I'm saying this advisedly over Zoom, not knowing who it is and all the rest. I would say, don't jump.
She's a formidable, incredibly strong, resilient human being.
Okay, I would not jump to the label depression. Okay, because it comes with a whole lot of nuances and overtones and stresses. Everybody is going to experience lowered mood in this time. Okay, I have found myself, my wife she's an unmedicated ADHD and wants to, dart me every morning with a veterinary dart with Ritalin or Concerta.
I'll supply.
Yeah, I'm not administratively challenged, but I find at the moment I'm way less efficient. I'm way less efficient than I usually am. And I'm usually a bit of an energizer bunny about certain things, and I'm not. So everybody is going to experience lowered mood, and the symptoms they're going to experience are what we call the neurovegetative features of depression. There will be lowered energy. There'll either be not eating enough or overeating. Your appetite might alter. Sleep patterns might alter. Either you're sleeping too much, hypersomnia, or insomnia, we're not sleeping enough, you're getting bad sleep. That's compared to what you normally would have normal. These are changes in these patterns. Changes in short-term memory and concentration. Finding that your brain is not as optimal as usual. A change in libido, either hyperlibido or under. And also just finding you might not be enjoying things you used to enjoy. You might kind of find, and then you start to find a very pessimistic view starts to dominate your thinking. These are what we call the neurovegetative features of depression. So people might experience these to some degree. Okay. When it becomes serious that you need to seek professional help is when, according to the DSM, which is psychiatrists, that's the diagnostic manual use, is when you experience most of these symptoms for most of the day over a 2-week period, at which point you really need to go and seek medical help. But most people, as well as trying to point out the resilience issue, is that if you apply, you are able to sit back and say, okay, look, I feel helpless, I'm feeling these symptoms, but there are some things I could do to help myself. That you'd find that those things are quite powerful. So people have found, much as I sometimes, I'm very pro it, but I don't like the pop psychology aspect of it, meditation, just taking time to breathe, to meditate, calm yourself. There's an app, I can't remember what it's called, there's a very popular app that people are using that does meditation stuff. People have found it very useful. Things like, if you don't go running, because I personally think there's lots of antipsychotic medication for runners, go for a brisk walk. Take some time to speak to family. I find for myself, I'm talking less to my family, my extended family, than I normally do. And 2 nights ago, I thought, okay, I have to make an effort to actually get a family meeting going. Just, even though it's over Zoom, to just do it as normal as you can in these abnormal times, you will feel a little bit better. It might not take away all those feelings, but that once we start to get back to normal, you'll probably find as you get back to your normal stream of life, when lockdown is lifted and COVID seems to be under control, whenever that might be, you'll find a lot of these things will dissipate.
Well, on that, and then we'll make this the final question, although I apologize for those questions we were unable to get to. There are about 15 to 20 questions here, and I apologize. But this question resonates with me. I'm looking how clients are behaving. I'm looking how my friends and colleagues are behaving. And the question verbatim is for those individuals that have this defense response, that aren't using logic and seem to be in survival mode. They're making very large, rash, life-altering decisions under these heightened stress levels. Once things return to some form of normality, whatever that might be, do they at that stage force themselves to reevaluate these decisions, backtrack with them, justify them, or just live with them and move past it?
It's a hard question. It's a good question and a hard one. I think people who, let's say, have a more mature sense of self will probably reevaluate. But we have a thing called cognitive dissonance, where we have to mediate 2 opposite ideas in our brain. And there's no model for, it was identified as a theory in the 50s and has been worked on since then. They're going to have to resolve that. And the people who are prepared to think about it will take probably more effective steps. Otherwise, people will just use justification to say, no, I was right. And, I resent what happened and blame, like externalize blame, because they can't deal with the fact that maybe they made a mistake. Whereas I think if you have a more mature sense of self, you're able to say, look, maybe I cocked that one. But there is a remedy. Everything can be fixed in some way. There's always a remedy. So I can't answer that question fully.
I think you did. So, Pinchas, as you can hear, we should have set this one for 2 hours because there must be 20 questions here. And I apologize to everybody whose questions I'm unable to ask. But thank you, everybody, for joining. In particular, I'd like to take a moment to very sincerely thank Pinchas for his massive contribution. Pinchas, I might very well beg you to come back at a later stage because I think as this lockdown goes on for I don't know how long, and the psychological effects can only be exacerbated and exaggerated over time. I think we're going to need more of your insights. So thank you very, very much for taking and carving time out of your very busy diary. And may your diary only get busier and more ka-ching, as you like to call it. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I really do appreciate you guys joining us every week. Next week, we have Professor Eddie Wolf. I think Pinchas probably knows who he is. In fact, did he lecture you?
No, he was at UJ when I was at Wits.
He was at UJ. Okay, so he'll be talking about a different element of psychology. So we look forward to him being our speaker next week, and the invitation will go out quite soon. And the week after that, we have something from Discovery. So, and some really, really exciting stuff coming up. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us every week, and thank you to Susan Moffat for putting this whole thing together. We don't give her enough thanks. This is our marketing consultant who really, we get on here with no preparation because she's done it all, and I just kind of pretty much read from a script. So thank you to Susan for everything that you do as well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Stay warm, stay healthy, stay safe. Look after your fellow man. God bless.